Welcome to this presentation about the limitations on the uses of isolation and restraint with regard to students receiving special education services. In this presentation, we will discuss where the rules about isolation and restraint come from, what isolation means, what restraint means, the very limited situations in which isolation and/or restraint are allowable, and the notification and documentation procedures school staff must follow after an isolation or restraint incident. Please note, these rules apply to the treatment of students receiving special education services, though there is some overlap between these rules and those applying to other students. We will discuss those rules in a separate presentation. Let's begin. In 2008, the Tennessee State Legislature passed the Special Education Isolation and Restraint Modernization and Positive Behavioral Supports Act, which went into effect in 2009. This law provides local education agencies with a uniform standard to follow with regard to the use of isolation and restraint of students receiving special education services. It also provides certain legal protections to school personnel who follow the prescribed procedures. The law's purposes are to prevent the unreasonable, unsafe, and unwarranted uses of isolation and restraint practices, as well as to encourage more positive behavioral supports while still protecting the student, teachers, and others from physical harm. Important note, these rules apply to any and all school personnel, whether full-time or part-time, and whether or not the provision of special education services is a primary part of their day-to-day duties. Now, let's get to the rules. What does isolation mean? Isolation, also known as seclusion, means the confinement of a student alone, in a room with or without a door, or other enclosed area or structure, where the student is physically prevented from leaving. Note, this definition is not necessarily limited to instances in which a student is confined by a locked or closed door, and it applies to any sort of enclosed area or structure. That said, the typical and often used timeout procedure is not a violation of these rules, even if the timeout involves the voluntary separation of the student from others. Now, let's consider the definition of restraint. In short, a restraint is anything that restricts a student's freedom of movement and/or normal access to the student's body. This also applies to any action that removes access to mobility from an otherwise immobile student, such as disabling a motorized wheelchair. The form of restraint that comes most quickly to mind is physical holding restraint, which is the use of body contact with the student for purposes of restraint. Other forms of restraint include mechanical restraint, which means the use of a mechanical device, material, or equipment attached or adjacent to a student's body. There's also chemical restraint, defined as the use of medication prescribed to restrict a student's freedom of movement for the control of extreme violent physical behavior. Chemical restraint does not include medications comprising a student's regular medical regimen, including so-called PRN or as-needed medications. Under the rules, mechanical restraint and chemical restraint are absolutely prohibited at all times. Only physical holding restraint is allowed, and only then under very limited circumstances. In a nutshell, unless the student's individualized education program, commonly known as an IEP, says otherwise, isolation and physical holding restraint of students receiving special education services may only be used in emergency situations and no others. For instance, it cannot be used for coercion or forced compliance, for the convenience of others, or for retaliation. An emergency situation only exists if the student's behavior poses a threat to the physical safety of the student or others nearby. A few notes on this standard. Bear in mind that the phrase threat to physical safety for these purposes means there is a risk of serious harm to the student or others. By way of illustration, a situation in which a student threatening to throw a wad of paper at another student is unlikely to qualify as an emergency situation because there's little potential for serious harm. A student threatening to throw a large hardcover book at the head of another student at close range, however, would more likely qualify. And, certainly, a student using or threatening to use a deadly weapon against another student would easily qualify. Also remember that the risk of damage to property alone will never rise to the level of an emergency situation under these standards unless that damage risks serious harm to the student or others. This is in keeping with the general principle that the protection of personal safety is more important than the protection of property. Finally, isolation and restraint procedures should be undertaken as last resort measures only, and only to the extent reasonably necessary to address the emergency situation. Once a student has been properly isolated and/or restrained under these circumstances, which is to say, once the emergency has been properly addressed, school personnel are obligated to follow a number of important procedures. Number 1. Someone must remain in the physical presence of and continuously observe the student who is isolated or being restrained to monitor the health and well-being of the student. Number 2. A principal or other designee authorized to evaluate the student's condition must be notified immediately of the situation. Number 3. The student's parent or guardian must be notified of the incident either by oral or written communication, and no later than the same day the incident occurred. Once the incident is concluded, the school principal or his or her designee is responsible for its reporting and documentation on the Easy IEP system, and a copy of the report must be made available at IEP meetings as well as upon the request of the parent or guardian of the student. Additionally, the student and any adult or other student involved in the incident should be evaluated by a school nurse or other person with equivalent expertise. Now, let's review the information in this presentation with a short quiz. Question 1. Under the Special Education, Isolation and Restraint Modernization and Positive Behavioral Supports Act, what kinds of restraint are allowed under appropriate circumstances? A. Mechanical restraint. B. Chemical restraint. C. Physical holding restraint. D. Both A and C. The correct answer is C. Physical holding restraint. Neither mechanical nor chemical restraints are allowed. Question 2. The IEP of a student receiving special education services does not expressly allow for the use of isolation and restraint procedures with the student. Which of the following is correct? A. Isolation and restraint procedures may never be used with the student. B. Isolation and restraint procedures may only be used if the student's personal safety would otherwise be at risk. C. Isolation and restraint procedures may only be used with the student if there is a threat of serious harm to another student. Or D. Isolation and restraint may only be used if there is a threat of serious harm to the student or others nearby. The correct answer is D. Isolation and restraint procedures may be used with the student receiving special education services if there is a threat of serious harm to the student or others nearby. This is the case even if the student's IEP does not expressly allow for isolation and restraint procedures. Question 3. Which of the following would likely qualify as an emergency situation allowing for the use of isolation and restraint with a student receiving special education services? A. The student threatens to swing a baseball bat at a chair in which another student is sitting. B. The student is alone and throws a chair against a wall. C. The student holds a chair over another student's head and threatens to injure the other student with the chair. D. Both A and C. The answer is D. A and C are both correct because in both situations there is risk of serious harm to another student, whereas in B, the only potential damage is to property. This concludes our presentation on the use of isolation and restraint with regard to students receiving special education services. We hope you found this presentation useful and informative. Thanks for watching, and thank you for all you do for the students and families of Tennessee. Have a terrific school year.
Class dismissed.